In this video, I'm going over the 4 types of poker mistakes. Knowing what kind of mistakes you make is a crucial step towards fixing them, and most players primarily focus on skill mistakes, which are often only a fraction of the mistakes they actually make. So as we go through these, try to think about which one shows up most often in your own game, and I'll show you the 4 main categories first, and then we'll dive into each one. And only one of these mistakes is actually about poker knowledge. The other 3 are mental game mistakes. So let's get into them now. Number 1 is a skill or a knowledge mistake. Number 2 is focus mistakes. Number 3 is emotional mistakes. And finally, there are bias mistakes. And I think this one is the most interesting, and we'll break it down further when we get to it. But for now, let's get into skill or knowledge mistakes. This is just when you don't yet know the correct strategy. So some examples could be misunderstanding ranges, incorrect frequencies, wrong actions, or wrong bet sizing. And my whole channel is focused on improving poker skills, so I'm not going to go deep into how to fix skill mistakes or how to use a solver here in this video. But these are the primary ways to work on your skills and expand your knowledge and understanding of poker as a strategy game. You can use a solver, watch good training content, and or get coaching or feedback from peers or anyone that you study with. And again, even though I'm not going to dive deep into how to use a solver here, one solver tip is while you're looking at strategies, try to develop or pull from the solver what questions can you ask yourself in game that might lead you to a strategy that looks like the solver output. So for example, if you're studying a river spot and out of position gets a B40 size, and you see that they're betting weak second pair for value, then you could sort of pull the question from that output, what is the worst hand I want to bet for value here? And if you get into the habit of asking that question while you're playing, that can help determine what your smaller bet size should be out of position on the river, for instance. And just keep in mind, the goal is not to play like a solver, but to think like a solver. But let's dive into these other types of mistakes now. So again, number 2 is focus mistakes. This is when you know the correct or at least a better play, but you fail to execute. Some of the most common causes of this are autopiloting, playing too many tables, or distractions. Distractions could be something like music, having a podcast on, multitasking, your phone, you get the gist, that kind of stuff. Let's talk about how to fix or address your focus mistakes. First, I would suggest trying to clear your head before sessions. This could look like going for a walk, maybe meditating. I personally use an app called Primed Mind. Primed Mind is a hypnotherapy app that was developed by Fedor Holtz and Elliot Rowe. And I'm not affiliated with them at all, but they have poker-specific hypnotherapy audio sessions that last anywhere from like 5 to 13 minutes. And I find that listening to them before sessions really helps sort of clear my head and stay focused throughout the session. Another important way to fix or address your focus mistakes are to play short sessions and take regular breaks. Everyone has a rough amount of time that they can really remain fully focused without slipping. And for me, I've found that it's around 90 minutes. So I'd recommend figuring out what that threshold is for you and trying to schedule your breaks around it. I heard someone say on a podcast recently that live tournaments are sort of like battles of the C games, but online cash games are like a battle of the A games, because there's basically no excuse to not play at the top of your game when you're playing online cash games, just because you can always take a break, or if you didn't get enough sleep, just not play that day, and so on. Okay, moving on, reduced number of tables. I have seen super consistently over the years that players' win rates drop significantly once they add more than 4 tables. And so I'm not saying you can't play more than 4. I would say don't play more than 6. If you're playing more than 6 tables, you're just not going to be able to think through decisions as deeply as is required to maintain a high win rate. The next strategy would be to remove distractions. Music with lyrics is probably not a good idea, and certainly you shouldn't have a video on another monitor or anything like that. Also, there is research that shows that having your phone where you can see it, even if it's on silent, messes with your brain and reduces your ability to focus. So I would suggest turning your phone on silent and keeping it out of sight during sessions. And this last one is actually one of the things that I find most helpful for me, which is to talk out loud to yourself while you play. In other words, talk through the decisions that you're making out loud while you play online. And this might feel kind of silly at first, but again, I find it super helpful and still do it myself all the time. Talking out loud through the decision-making process helps remove your ego and focus just on the decision-making. And it also prevents you from autopiloting if you're verbalizing every decision that you make. So hopefully all that makes sense. You don't necessarily have to implement every single one of these at once, although it definitely couldn't hurt. But maybe choose a couple if you're not used to doing any of these to start with. And I do really think it's optimal to use all of them. The talking out loud to yourself may or may not be optimal for everyone. It is for me, but I would recommend trying it out. All right, let's move on to emotional mistakes. And this is when emotions override your decision making. Another word for emotional mistakes is basically tilt, which can be defined as any time your emotions lead you to deviate from your best decision making. So some examples of tilt could be revenge bluffing, entitlement calling, or chasing losses. I think most of us have experienced one or more of these at some point to varying degrees, but let's dive into how to fix your emotional mistakes. Number one is journaling. Journaling is probably the main thing you can do to actually change the pathways that lead you to tilt, and it gets more to addressing the root of the issue, whereas these other methods that I'm going to go over next, while they can be useful, could be seen more as band-aids. So before or after your sessions, try journaling about the type of emotional mistake that you make. So in other words, identify the specific emotion. Was it frustration, anger, entitlement, maybe like giddiness from winning a big pot recently, so you play more optimistically, etc. Once you can identify and understand the emotion behind whatever mistake you're making, you're able to play in a more present and less reactionary way. And if you feel resistant to journaling, I would just say try it before dismissing it. Personally, I've journaled on and off for a very long time about things outside of poker, but if it's not a practice that you've ever gotten into, again, you might be surprised at how useful it can actually be. Next, we have breath work. After I play a hand that gives me some sort of frustration, I find it helpful to take a deep breath and sort of going into the next method, remember why I'm playing this game. Personally, I don't play poker to gamble. I'm playing to make the best strategic decisions I can and win in the long run. Next method, I know I mentioned this earlier, but again, primed mind can help steady your emotions while you're playing. At least that's what it does for me. And I would also suggest implementing this rule that I've had for a long time. If you make 2 emotional mistakes within one session, then just end your session and take a break until you feel ready to focus on the best decision making you can, and you don't feel like you're starting a session for any sort of emotional reason. Okay, and now we're getting into what I think is the most interesting type of mistake, and that is bias mistakes. And I've actually broken this down into 4 different kinds of bias mistakes. So number 1 is looking for reasons to do what you want to do. So for instance, if someone makes a big bet on the river and you want to see what they have and you want to call, then it can be easy to analyze the hand in a way that you're looking for reasons to call, but you're not necessarily looking for reasons to fold. So that's sort of the first kind of bias mistake. Next, we have recency or observational bias. And this is basically overcorrecting based on a small sample and assuming there's a relevant pattern when it's really just noise that you've been seeing. So an example of this could be someone shows up with a bluff, and then you get into another hand with them and they bet, and you think, oh, I saw them bluff, so they're probably bluffing or they're probably over bluffing or something like that. So that would be, again, recency/observational bias. Number 3 is confirmation bias. And this usually manifests as thinking that winning a hand means you made the right play, and then sort of continuing to take a line that might not be great, but that has caused you to win a couple big pots, for instance. But as we know, just because you win a pot doesn't mean that you played it well necessarily. And then number 4 is projecting your own thinking onto opponents. This can look like, again, if your opponent, for instance, makes a big river bet, maybe you wouldn't think that's a good spot to bluff, or maybe you have a tendency to underbluff. So you just assume that your opponent is probably underbluffing as well. And one really interesting thing that I've learned from coaching a bunch of different students is that so many poker players think that everyone else has the same natural tendencies that they do. Some people just tend to play tighter and sort of more scared, and they assume other people have that same attitude. And when those people start learning, let's say, pre-flop ranges from a solver, they're surprised at how loose they are. Whereas other people tend to play looser just sort of naturally. And so they assume other people like to play looser. And when they encounter the solver ranges, they're surprised at how tight they are. And so the way that people think and approach the game is different and unique to them. And so I think it's important to kind of recognize and remember that and not just assume everyone else thinks the way you do. And now let's talk about how to fix those bias mistakes. First of all, use data instead of assumptions. If you think someone might be overbluffing the river, maybe look at their river bet percentage or dive into the hands that you've seen them play and get to showdown with in your database, that kind of thing. Next, and I think this is super important, remember your own tendencies. And again, journaling can actually be helpful to identify your personal tendencies so that then you can remember them right before playing or even while playing. So if you can realize that the way you approach the game is personal to you, you can be more unbiased when you're playing against other people. Finally, I think it's important to pause before big decisions and really take your time to think through the hand and think through your decision making, because bias mistakes usually happen when decisions are rushed or when you're playing quickly or sort of automatically, that kind of thing. So I hope that's helpful. Just again to recap, 4 types of poker mistakes. We have the skill, knowledge mistakes, focus mistakes, emotional mistakes, and bias mistakes. And feel free to use this video as a resource, rewind to the slides on how to fix these various mistakes, try to implement some of these strategies. And finally, here is a very simple framework for plugging your leaks in poker. Tag with your database software all hands where you made a mistake, at least where you identified that you made a mistake, not just the ones where you didn't understand the skill strategy. But I'm sure you have hands where you play the hand and then after the hand ends, you realize that you made some sort of mistake. Just tag it so you can analyze what sort of mistake it was later, perhaps figure out what emotion caused it, what bias caused it, and so on. So once you've tagged the hand, again, figure out what kind of mistake it was and work on the underlying issue. I think it's important to try to approach all of this with curiosity and being honest with, as well as non-judgmental towards yourself. If you have found this helpful at all, consider subscribing for more videos. Most of my channel is focused on no limit hold'em strategy, but I might make some more meta or soft skills videos in the future as well. So let me know what you think about this kind of thing in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.